In the ruins of post-war Europe, justice seemed absolute. Yet, many high-ranking figures of the Nazi regime walked away from the Nuremberg courtroom alive. Some were imprisoned, some acquitted, and others slipped into new lives in the shadows of history. This is the untold story of who survived, how they did it, and why their names still echo today. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the deep dive histories we uncover here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Let's see how far this story reaches. 1. Karl Dönitz. Karl Dönitz entered the final days of the Third Reich as the man Hitler believed could preserve a collapsing nation. A career naval officer and architect of the U-boat campaign, Dönitz embodied the rigid discipline and cold strategic focus of Germany's military elite. When Hitler named him successor in April 1945, the war was already lost, yet Dönitz attempted to negotiate partial surrenders to the Western Allies while continuing resistance against the Soviets. This dual strategy was less about victory than about shaping Germany's post-war fate and protecting as many troops and civilians as possible during the last chaotic days. At Nuremberg, Dönitz faced accusations related to unrestricted submarine warfare and his role in the Nazi leadership, but he avoided the harshest penalties. He received a 10-year sentence, significant, yet far lighter than many expected for someone who had stepped into Hitler's shoes. After his release in 1956, he retreated into a quiet life, publishing memoirs that attempted to distance himself from the broader criminality of the regime. His survival at Nuremberg wasn't accidental. It was the result of legal nuance, military politics, and Cold War priorities. But Dönitz is only the first in this unsettling roster of high-ranking figures who outlived the courtroom reckoning. And the next man's survival would be even more controversial. 2. Albert Speer. Albert Speer, the good Nazi in his own telling, remains one of the most debated figures to emerge from the Nuremberg trials. As Hitler's chief architect turned Minister of Armaments, Speer oversaw a dramatic increase in war production. He cultivated an image of technical efficiency, presenting himself as a rational administrator rather than an ideologue. Yet, behind that facade lay a vast system of forced labor, industrial exploitation, and the relentless prolonging of a war that was already lost. At Nuremberg, Speer did something few other defendants attempted. He admitted a degree of responsibility. His carefully constructed narrative of partial guilt, combined with his portrayal as apolitical and technocratic, influenced the tribunal. Instead of a death sentence, he received 20 years in Spandau prison. This punishment has long been criticized as too lenient, given his central role in sustaining Germany's war machine. After his release in 1966, Speer reinvented himself as a best-selling memoirist, shaping public memory of the Third Reich with a mix of confession and omission. His survival was not just legal, it was reputational, allowing him to recast his legacy in ways others could not. And yet, the courtroom leniency he received would be even more pronounced in the case of the next figure, whose acquittal stunned the world. If you're finding this breakdown insightful so far, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapters we uncover. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always incredible to see this community span the world. 3. Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht, the financial wizard who helped rebuild Germany's economy in the 1930s, occupied a rare position within the Nazi hierarchy. Indispensable to the regime's rise, yet later sidelined and even imprisoned by it. As president of the Reichsbank, Schacht engineered economic recovery, rearmament financing, and the early stabilization that gave Hitler the credibility he needed to consolidate power. But Schacht's relationship with the regime was complicated. He eventually clashed with Nazi leadership over economic policy and the increasingly radical direction of the state. At Nuremberg, prosecutors charged him with conspiracy and crimes against peace, arguing that his economic innovations made rearmament possible. Schacht countered with a defense anchored in technicalities and political distancing. He insisted he was a nationalist economist, not a participant in the later atrocities or military decisions. To the astonishment of many, and outrage of some, Schacht was acquitted. His escape from conviction remains one of the most controversial outcomes of the trials. Afterward, he returned to financial consulting and attempted to rehabilitate his public image, leveraging the tribunal's judgment as vindication. But Schacht's acquittal only sets the stage for the next figure, someone whose long involvement in Nazi foreign policy and repressive rule would lead to a very different verdict. 4. Konstantin von Neurath. Konstantin von Neurath was an old-school diplomat whose career began long before the Nazis rose to power. As foreign minister from 1932 to 1938, he oversaw Germany's withdrawal from the League of Nations, the reoccupation of the Rhineland, and the early stages of rearmament, all moves that strengthened Hitler's bargaining position in Europe. Although Neurath tried to present himself as a moderating force, the historical record shows that he played an essential role in enabling the regime during its critical formative years. His polished manners and aristocratic background helped mask the aggressive policies he supported behind closed doors. After being replaced by Ribbentrop, Neurath was appointed Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia. His tenure coincided with harsh repression and deepening control over the region. Neurath later claimed he disagreed with radical policies imposed by Berlin, but he never resigned, and he continued to implement measures that strengthened Nazi administration in the territory. At Nuremberg, prosecutors focused heavily on his diplomatic contributions to the regime's expansion and his involvement in governing occupied lands. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years. Released early due to health concerns, Neurath spent the remainder of his life quietly in West Germany. Yet compared to him, the next figure did not just support the regime. He shaped the very identity of its youth. 5. Baldur von Schirach. Baldur von Schirach stood at the center of one of the most influential institutions of the Third Reich, the Hitler Youth. As its leader, he helped mold millions of German children into loyal followers of the regime, promoting a rigid blend of nationalism, obedience, and ideological devotion. His charisma and organizational skill turned youth culture into a political tool, embedding Nazi doctrine into everyday life. Later, as Gauleiter of Vienna, he oversaw policies that aligned with the regime's broader goals of control and displacement. Even though he attempted to frame himself as culturally minded and less political, his authority contributed directly to the environment that allowed systematic persecution to advance. At Nuremberg, Schirach attempted to distance himself from the ideology he once championed so enthusiastically. He acknowledged moral responsibility for certain actions while denying knowledge of broader government crimes. This partly contrite posture, combined with his focus on youth affairs rather than military strategy, influenced the tribunal to sentence him to 20 years rather than impose harsher penalties. Following his release from Spandau prison, Schirach lived a low-profile life, publishing memoirs and maintaining that he had been misled by the regime he once served. His case illustrates how influence can be exercised not only through armies or ministries, but through shaping society itself. And yet, the man who follows in this list played a very different role. He held the keys to Germany's economy. 6. Walther Funk. Walther Funk began his career as a journalist and economic commentator before rising rapidly through the Nazi political structure. As Minister of Economics and later President of the Reichsbank, Funk became one of the central figures responsible for aligning the German financial system with the regime's war aims. His policies ensured that industry, banking, and state planning worked in coordination, allowing the government to mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale. Funk also facilitated measures that transferred assets and wealth into state hands, strengthening the economic foundations of the war effort. During the Nuremberg trials, Funk faced charges related to his managerial role within this system. He struggled to defend himself against accusations that his financial leadership contributed to enabling the regime's wider agenda. While he claimed he lacked authority over certain decisions made by more powerful officials, the tribunal found him legally responsible for helping maintain the machinery that supported the war. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, though released in 1957 due to deteriorating health. Funk's story is a reminder that power in the Third Reich took many forms, and economic policy was one of its most effective instruments. But while he operated through fiscal strategy, the next man on the list commanded the German Navy with sweeping authority and faced his own reckoning after the war. 7. Erich Raeder. Erich Raeder, the long-serving commander-in-chief of the German Navy, was one of the earliest and most influential military leaders to align his career with Hitler's ambitions. A veteran of the Imperial Navy, Raeder envisioned a resurgent Germany equipped with a world-class fleet capable of challenging major naval powers. Under his leadership, the Navy expanded rapidly, pursuing the ambitious Plan Z, which aimed to build battleships and aircraft carriers to project German power far beyond Europe. Although the plan was never completed due to the outbreak of war, Raeder's strategic vision shaped the Navy's operations throughout the early years of the conflict. Despite his professional demeanor, Raeder supported aggressive expansions and played a part in planning maneuvers that violated international agreements. He advocated for military action in Norway and promoted tactics that destabilized the pre-war order. By 1943, disagreements with Hitler led to his replacement by Karl Dönitz, yet Raeder's influence over naval policy remained significant. At Nuremberg, Raeder was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in promoting and executing the regime's military agenda. He was released early in 1955 due to health concerns. Raeder's career illustrates how seasoned officers lent legitimacy to Hitler's government, and the next figure on the list used his political background to do the same in an entirely different arena. 8. Franz von Papen. Franz von Papen was a conservative statesman who played a crucial, if deeply controversial, role in Hitler's rise to power. A former Chancellor of Germany, von Papen believed he could harness Hitler's popularity while keeping him in check through traditional political structures. This miscalculation became one of the most consequential decisions in modern political history. Convinced he could manipulate the Nazi movement for his own ends, Papen instead helped open the door for Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in 1933. The belief that the new regime could be moderated from within proved disastrously wrong. After the Nazis consolidated control, von Papen continued to serve as a diplomat, representing Germany and Austria and later Turkey. Although he was not part of the ideological core of the regime, his actions enabled its early legitimacy abroad. At Nuremberg, prosecutors charged him with aiding the regime's aggressive expansion, but von Papen portrayed himself as a statesman caught between forces larger than himself. His defense successfully argued that his diplomatic roles did not constitute direct involvement in criminal planning, leading to his acquittal. Von Papen's case demonstrated how political maneuvering and personal ambition helped shape the early Nazi state. But while he survived the courtroom entirely, the next figure's path to acquittal was even more striking, because he came not from the diplomatic world but from the realm of propaganda. 9. Hans Fritzsche. Hans Fritzsche served within Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, where he oversaw radio broadcasts that reached millions of Germans. Although not as widely recognized as other figures in the propaganda apparatus, Fritzsche wielded considerable influence through his daily commentary, which helped shape public perception during the war. His calm, authoritative voice made him a familiar presence, and he became known for delivering regime-approved interpretations of military events, political developments, and national morale. Fritzsche's work was central to maintaining internal unity and reinforcing the government's messaging. However, Unlike key propagandists who orchestrated ideological campaigns at the highest level, Fritzsche operated within a narrower scope. This distinction became critical during his trial. At Nuremberg, prosecutors initially charged him alongside major political leaders, arguing that his broadcasts supported the regime's agenda. But the tribunal ultimately concluded that his role, though influential, did not involve direct participation in the policies under scrutiny. As a result, Fritzsche was acquitted. His acquittal raised questions about where the line should be drawn between influence and responsibility, especially in a state built on controlled information. And the ambiguity surrounding his case sets the stage for the next figure, someone whose scientific achievements would overshadow his wartime service in a different kind of moral controversy. 10. Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun remains one of the most controversial figures to survive the Nazi era, not because he escaped punishment at Nuremberg, but because he was never put on trial at all. A brilliant engineer and visionary, von Braun led the development of the V-2 rocket program, a technological leap that would later shape the future of space exploration. During the war, he worked within a system that prioritized scientific achievement for military purposes, and his research became a symbol of the regime's ambition to strike distant targets with unprecedented precision. His work advanced rapidly due to vast state resources and the pressure of wartime urgency. After Germany's defeat, von Braun and many members of his team surrendered to American forces. Recognizing his scientific value, the United States brought him to America under Operation Paperclip, where he became a leading figure in the early space program. His transformation, from a key figure in Germany's wartime rocket development to a central architect of NASA's achievements, remains one of the most dramatic rehabilitations of any former member of the regime. Von Braun's survival and subsequent fame raised difficult questions about scientific responsibility, political compromise, and the boundaries of accountability. Yet the next figure on the list faced no such post-war reinvention. Instead, his fate was decided through the military courts that examined his actions across occupied Europe. 11. Wilhelm List. Wilhelm List, a senior field marshal, rose through the ranks of the German army and played a prominent role in the invasions of the Balkans and the early stages of the war against the Soviet Union. Known for his organizational skill and methodical approach, List commanded large formations across multiple fronts. His leadership contributed to Germany's rapid advances in southeastern Europe, where his forces carried out broad military objectives under complex and often unstable regional conditions. Following the war, List did not appear before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, but instead faced trial during the hostages case, one of the subsequent American-led proceedings. Prosecutors argued that he bore responsibility for harsh occupation policies and for failing to control the actions of units under his command. List defended himself by claiming that the chaotic nature of guerrilla warfare in the region restricted his ability to maintain order. The tribunal sentenced him to life imprisonment, though he was released early in 1952 due to health issues. His case highlights the expanding scope of post-war justice, which extended beyond the main Nuremberg courtroom to address military actions throughout occupied territories. And the next figure's trial would push these debates even further, as he became one of the most prominent generals to face charges after the war. 12. Erich von Manstein. Erich von Manstein remains one of the most prominent military strategists of the Second World War, celebrated among professional soldiers for his operational brilliance, while heavily criticized for his loyalty to a destructive regime. He played a central role in planning the invasion of France, crafting the Sichelschnitt maneuver that allowed German forces to bypass Allied defenses and achieve a rapid victory. Later, on the Eastern Front, he commanded large formations in some of the war's most pivotal battles, demonstrating both tactical adaptability and an unwavering commitment to military objectives. After Germany's defeat, von Manstein was not tried at the main Nuremberg tribunal, but was later prosecuted by a British military court. Charges focused on his conduct during operations in the East and his failure to prevent abuses within territories under his authority. He defended himself by framing his actions as strictly military and argued that he maintained discipline to the extent possible under wartime conditions. Ultimately, he was convicted and sentenced to 18 years, though he was released early in 1953. Manstein's post-war writings helped shape the early Cold War narrative of the German army as a purely professional force, a view later questioned by historians. His complicated legacy leads directly to the next figure, another field marshal whose path through the war and its aftermath unfolded under equally intense scrutiny. 13. Albert Kesselring. Albert Kesselring was one of the most visible and influential commanders in the German military, serving first in the Luftwaffe and later as the supreme commander of German forces in Italy. Known for his upbeat demeanor and energetic leadership style, Kesselring was trusted by Hitler and admired by many within the military for his adaptability. In Italy, he oversaw the construction of multiple defensive lines that slowed the Allied advance, turning the rugged landscape into a prolonged battleground. His command decisions demonstrated both strategic flexibility and a relentless commitment to holding territory, even as Germany's position weakened dramatically. After the war, Kesselring was tried by a British military court, which accused him of failing to prevent harsh measures imposed under his command. He argued that many of the actions taken by his subordinates were conducted without his direct knowledge, and claimed that his primary goal had been the preservation of stability along a collapsing front. Despite a death sentence initially being issued, the verdict was later commuted, and Kesselring was released in 1952 for health reasons. Kesselring's case became part of a broader debate over the legacy of high-ranking officers who combined tactical ingenuity with unwavering loyalty. And his complicated story leads straight into the life of another towering military figure who shaped Germany's campaigns across multiple fronts. 14. Gerd von Rundstedt. Gerd von Rundstedt was one of the oldest and most experienced commanders in the German army, a career officer whose service stretched back to the days of the Kaiser. Known for his traditionalist outlook and often blunt opinions, Rundstedt played major roles in the invasions of Poland, France, and later the Soviet Union. His authority extended over vast battle zones, and he regularly commanded some of the largest formations deployed during the war. Even when he disagreed with Hitler's directives, Rundstedt remained loyal, choosing to continue his duties rather than challenge the political leadership. After Germany's defeat, Rundstedt was arrested and interrogated, but he was never brought before a tribunal. British authorities ultimately determined that his failing health made a full trial impossible. Despite avoiding courtroom judgment, Rundstedt's military record sparked ongoing debate, especially regarding the extent to which senior commanders should have resisted unlawful orders or removed themselves from positions of authority. He spent the remainder of his life in quiet retirement, occasionally granting interviews that offered glimpses into his views on the war and its aftermath. Rundstedt's story illustrates how senior officers could evade legal consequences without ever fully escaping public scrutiny. And next comes another general, one whose battlefield reputation was overshadowed by the controversies surrounding his post-war sentencing. 15. Hermann Hoth. Hermann Hoth emerged as one of Germany's most aggressive tank commanders, known for his ability to direct fast-moving armored units across wide distances. He played key roles in the invasions of France and the Soviet Union, particularly during the early phases when German mechanized forces achieved rapid breakthroughs. Hoth's leadership emphasized mobility and decisive action, making him a central figure in several major campaigns. His operational style reflected the broader strategic aims of the German army, which sought quick, overwhelming advances to compensate for limited long-term resources. After the war, Hoth was tried during the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, where prosecutors focused on his responsibilities as a commander in occupied territories. His defense insisted that his primary concern had been military effectiveness, and that he maintained discipline within his units. The tribunal ultimately sentenced him to 15 years, citing his authority over large areas where harsh measures were carried out. He was released early in the 1950s, part of a broader wave of sentence reductions as the political climate shifted during the early Cold War. Hoth's case highlights how operational brilliance could not shield senior officers from scrutiny once the conflict ended, and his story leads directly into the life of another commander who faced legal questions about his wartime role, one whose experience reflected the challenges of maintaining military authority under extreme conditions. 16. Wilhelm von Leeb. Wilhelm von Leeb was one of the German Army's senior field marshals, a figure known for his calm temperament and methodical approach to command. His military career stretched across multiple eras of German history, giving him a reputation as a traditional officer shaped by old-world values rather than by the ideology that dominated the Nazi leadership. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, von Leeb commanded Army Group North, tasked with advancing toward Leningrad. Under his leadership, the group made significant initial gains, pushing deep into Soviet territory and contributing to the encirclement of the city. However, the campaign soon stalled, leaving von Leeb in charge of forces occupying vast areas and engaging in prolonged siege warfare. His command became embroiled in difficult questions surrounding military responsibility, control, and the conduct of troops in occupied zones. After being relieved of duty in 1942, he withdrew from active service and maintained a low profile for the remainder of the war. At the subsequent Nuremberg trials, von Leeb was charged with failing to prevent abuses within his area of authority. He was ultimately sentenced to 3 years, effectively time served, making his penalty one of the lightest among high-ranking officers. His case underscored the tribunal's struggle to balance individual accountability with the complexities of wartime command, and the next figure faced an even more complicated legacy as he led the German army at a critical moment in its history. 17. Walther von Brauchitsch. Walther von Brauchitsch served as commander-in-chief of the German army during some of the most decisive early years of the war. Quiet, disciplined, and intensely focused on military professionalism, he often found himself caught between the traditional officer corps and Hitler's increasingly direct interference in military decisions. Under von Brauchitsch's leadership, the army achieved major victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans, although these successes gradually gave way to severe strategic strains once the conflict shifted to the Eastern Front. Von Brauchitsch struggled with the growing tension between military judgment and political demands, especially as Hitler tightened his control over operational planning. He attempted to shield the army from political influence, but his efforts frequently failed, and he became increasingly marginalized. By late 1941, as the Soviet campaign faltered, Hitler dismissed him and assumed personal command of the army. After the war, von Brauchitsch was taken into British custody and was expected to stand trial for his wartime role. However, he never reached the courtroom. His declining health prevented prosecution, and he died in 1948. His inability to face judgment left many questions unresolved and set the stage for yet another towering military figure, one whose name became synonymous with armored warfare. 18. Heinz Guderian. Heinz Guderian was one of the most innovative and influential military thinkers of the era, celebrated within military circles for shaping the principles of modern armored warfare. His ideas on rapid mechanized movement helped define the tactics that led to early German successes, especially during the invasions of Poland and France. Guderian's emphasis on speed, concentrated force, and close coordination with air support transformed traditional battlefield strategies, making him one of the central architects of Germany's early wartime doctrine. During the war, he served in several high-level command roles on the Eastern Front, where he faced both logistical challenges and political interference. Known for his outspoken nature, Guderian frequently clashed with Hitler, especially when strategic decisions conflicted with professional military principles. Despite these tensions, he remained committed to the broader war effort and continued to serve until being dismissed in 1945. After the conflict, Guderian was interrogated but never brought to trial. His post-war writings, including influential memoirs, contributed to shaping public perceptions of the German General Staff and offered his own interpretation of events, a perspective later scrutinized by historians. His story flows directly into the next figure, another senior commander whose actions and post-war prosecution reveal additional layers of wartime responsibility and accountability. 19. Lothar Rendulic. Lothar Rendulic was an Austrian-born general whose career spanned multiple fronts, making him one of the most mobile and strategically flexible commanders in the German army. He served in the Balkans, on the Eastern Front, and in Northern Europe, often taking charge during chaotic phases of the conflict. Rendulic developed a reputation for strict discipline and decisive action, particularly during retreats, where he emphasized maintaining cohesion under pressure. His commands frequently involved complex terrain and volatile local conditions, demanding improvisation and constant adaptation. After the war, Rendulic became one of the central figures in the hostages trial, a proceeding that examined the actions of German commanders in southeastern Europe. Prosecutors argued that, as a senior officer, he bore responsibility for harsh countermeasures taken during anti-partisan operations and for failing to prevent excessive force within occupied territories. Rendulic defended himself by citing the challenges of irregular warfare, insisting that decisions were driven by military necessity rather than personal intent. The tribunal convicted him and issued a 20-year sentence, though he was released in 1951. His case highlights the legal complexities surrounding command responsibility during unconventional conflicts. And as the story moves forward, the next figure stands out for a very different reason. He never stood trial at all, despite holding a pivotal position within the German army's leadership. 20. Eduard Wagner. Eduard Wagner served as the Quartermaster General of the German Army, a role that placed him at the intersection of logistics, planning, and military administration. Far from being a frontline commander, Wagner's influence came from his oversight of supplies, transportation, and the coordination of resources across vast operational zones. His expertise allowed German forces to sustain long advances, particularly during the early stages of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Efficient supply chains were essential to the Army's rapid movements, and Wagner's organizational skill played a major role in making those advances possible. Wagner also became entangled in the internal power dynamics of the German military. As the war dragged on, he dealt with increasing shortages, deteriorating infrastructure, and rising tension between professional officers and political authorities. His position required constant negotiation with both military and civilian agencies. His colleagues later described him as a driven and deeply involved planner whose responsibilities expanded beyond the purely technical. Wagner did not face post-war prosecution because he died in 1944, preventing any legal examination of his wartime role. His absence from the courtroom left many aspects of his legacy open to interpretation, which in turn leads to one of the most famous participants in this list, a field marshal whose experience at Stalingrad turned him into an unexpected symbol of the war's turning tide. 21. Friedrich Paulus. Friedrich Paulus became one of the most widely recognized German commanders of the war, not only for his military career, but for the dramatic circumstances that defined its end. As the commander of the Sixth Army, he led one of the most powerful formations on the Eastern Front. His troops advanced deep into Soviet territory, culminating in the fateful push toward the city of Stalingrad. Initially confident, Paulus found his forces increasingly encircled and isolated as Soviet counteroffensives gained momentum. The campaign shifted from a bold advance to a desperate struggle for survival. In early 1943, Paulus made history by surrendering. becoming the first German field marshal to be captured alive. His decision shattered the myth that senior officers would fight to the last man and marked a decisive turning point in the war. During his time in Soviet captivity, Paulus publicly criticized the Nazi leadership and later testified at the Nuremberg trials, offering insight into the regime's military decision-making. Despite his willingness to cooperate with Allied authorities, Paulus was never put on trial himself. He spent his post-war years in East Germany, contributing to historical discussions about the conflict. His transformation from high-ranking commander to outspoken critic sets the stage for the next figure, a man whose career unfolded in the skies rather than on the battlefield. 22. Erhard Milch. Erhard Milch, a prominent figure in the Luftwaffe's leadership, played a central role in shaping Germany's air strategy throughout the war. A close associate of Hermann Göring, Milch oversaw aircraft production, logistics, and organizational reforms that helped transform the Luftwaffe into a formidable fighting force during the conflict's early years. His background in aviation management allowed him to modernize the industry and streamline processes, making him indispensable within the Air Ministry. Though he held a largely administrative position, his influence extended across both military planning and industrial output, giving him a broad view of Germany's war machinery. After the conflict, Milch faced trial during the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings. Prosecutors argued that his position gave him substantial authority over decisions that shaped air operations and their consequences. Milch defended himself by framing his role as primarily technical and organizational, emphasizing the bureaucracy he worked within rather than any direct operational control. The tribunal ultimately sentenced him to life imprisonment, though he was released in 1954 due to time served and changing political circumstances. Milch's case remains a notable example of how administrative power could intertwine with military objectives. And that connection is even more apparent in the story of the next figure, whose influence over labor and industry was so vast that it made him one of the most recognizable names brought to Nuremberg. 23. Robert Ley. Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, occupied one of the most powerful positions in the Third Reich's domestic sphere. A fiery speaker and devoted supporter of Hitler from the early days of the movement, Ley placed himself at the heart of the regime's efforts to reshape German society. His organization replaced trade unions, controlled wages and workplace conditions, and sought to align the workforce with political objectives. Ley's leadership style was forceful and often chaotic, but he commanded enormous influence through his control of labor structures and social programs designed to promote loyalty among German workers. Ley's prominence made him a central target of Allied investigators after the war. He was imprisoned and brought to Nuremberg, where he was expected to stand trial for his extensive role in supporting the regime's goals. His case promised to reveal the inner workings of Nazi labor policy and the mechanisms used to mobilize the population for war. Although he never reached a verdict, Ley's legacy lives on as an illustration of how domestic power and political ambition shaped the state from within. His absence from the courtroom, however, contrasts sharply with the next figure, a man whose frailty and age raised fundamental questions about how justice should be applied when a defendant cannot stand trial. 24. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach was the patriarch of one of Germany's most influential industrial families, presiding over a corporate empire that became deeply intertwined with the nation's rearmament efforts. As the head of the Krupp conglomerate, he helped coordinate industrial production that supported the military's growing needs. Even before the war, his company played a major part in rebuilding Germany's armaments capacity, aligning corporate interests with state ambitions. Though by the 1930s his sons and senior executives handled much of the daily management, Gustav remained the symbolic leader of a firm central to Germany's wartime industry. When the Allies compiled defendants for the Nuremberg trials, Gustav Krupp was initially selected due to his stature and long-standing involvement in rearmament. However, by the time proceedings began, his health had deteriorated severely. making him physically and mentally unfit to stand trial. The tribunal debated how to address his case, but ultimately chose not to proceed against someone incapable of participating in his own defense. Krupp's exclusion from the trial raised broader questions about accountability and the limits of post-war justice. And as the list reaches its final figure, the story shifts from industry and leadership to a fugitive whose post-war escape would become one of the most infamous in history. 25. Josef Mengele. Josef Mengele became one of the most notorious figures associated with the Nazi era, yet he was never captured, never tried, and never held accountable in a courtroom. Trained as a physician and anthropologist, he entered the regime's structures with ambitions that blended scientific curiosity with unwavering ideological loyalty. His wartime role placed him in a position of extraordinary authority, where he pursued research and made decisions that would shape the destiny of large numbers of people under his control. Within the hierarchy he served, his presence carried an aura of precision, confidence, and absolute certainty in the worldview he embraced. As the war reached its conclusion and German forces collapsed, Mengele fled, moving through chaotic escape routes that allowed him to slip away from Allied custody. Using forged papers and shifting identities, he made his way first through Europe and then to South America, where sympathetic networks enabled him to build a new life far from the courts assembling in Nuremberg. Despite international efforts to track him, he remained ahead of investigators for decades, living quietly under assumed names and relying on a small circle of supporters who shielded him from exposure. His ability to evade justice and his transformation into a symbol of unfinished accountability casts a long shadow over the entire list of surviving figures. And with this final name, the roster of individuals who escaped Nuremberg's harshest sentences brings the narrative to its unsettling conclusion, where every story deepens the question of what justice truly means in the aftermath of such a catastrophic era.